What if your very first breath cost the person who loved you most their last? That's the reality these twins were born into, cradled by grief before they ever knew love. But what they did with that pain changed the world. This is not just a story of loss. It's a story of legacy, of two boys who grew up with no mother, but built a life that made her name echo across generations. They say the first sound that filled the delivery room wasn't the wail of a newborn, but the silence of a heartbeat that had just stopped. While two baby boys came into the world gasping for air, their mother left them with a whisper. Her name was Elise Turner, only 28, a music teacher, a gentle soul, a dreamer who used to hum lullabies to her belly every night, not knowing she was singing goodbye. When the nurses wrapped the twins in soft hospital blankets, they whispered to each other how beautiful they were, identical, with their mother's auburn hair and her dimpled chin. But when they looked at the man slumped in the corner chair, hollow-eyed and frozen, they knew this day wouldn't be remembered for life. It would be remembered for what was lost. Michael Turner didn't speak a word. He couldn't. One hand clutched Elise's wedding ring, like it was the only thing keeping his world from falling apart. And in his other arm, two boys, Miles and Mason, wrapped together like they knew they had to hold on to each other just to survive what was coming. The house that once echoed with Elise's piano now stood painfully quiet. The bench where she taught neighborhood kids to play their first scales sat untouched. Dust began to gather on the keys like time itself had stopped in mourning. Michael tried. He did. He propped baby bottles where her sheet music used to be, changed diapers while staring blankly at family photos, and whispered bedtime stories with a voice that cracked from silence. But grief doesn't leave room for rhythm, and love, without its partner, sometimes forgets how to sound. Miles and Mason grew up knowing her only through fragments, an old video of her singing softly in the garden, a dried daisy pressed between the pages of her diary, a scarf that still carried her scent. They watched their father shrink into himself, day by day, like a man who couldn't figure out how to live in a world that no longer made sense. By the time the boys were 5, Michael had stopped playing guitar. By the time they were 7, he had stopped speaking of Elise at all. And yet, somehow, the twins were never bitter. Instead of asking why their mother wasn't here, they asked who she had been. They clung to every whisper of her memory. Hungry for stories, they begged their grandparents for tales of her childhood. They watched the single home video they had until the colors faded. Mason, the quieter of the two, would pause it on her smile and ask, "Do you think she would have liked me?" Miles would nod confidently. "She would have loved us. I know it." At school, they didn't talk about it. Other kids had moms who packed lunchboxes and kissed scraped knees. Miles and Mason had each other. When someone asked where their mom was, they would just glance at one another, an entire conversation exchanged in silence, and change the subject. It wasn't until their 9th birthday that something shifted. That morning, their father did something he hadn't done in years. He opened the lid of the old upright piano and sat down. The boys peeked from the hallway. Frozen, he stared at the keys for a long time, hands trembling, then whispered, "She used to say every song is a story. Maybe it's time we tell one." And for the first time in their lives, the boys heard music in their house. It was shaky, broken, unsure, but it was music, and it cracked something open that had been buried far too long. From that day on, Saturdays were song days. The piano became a place of healing, where Mason would hum melodies and Miles would scribble lyrics. Their mother had left them in silence, but her memory, her love, was finding its way back through sound. By the time they were 12, the twins had turned the old piano into something sacred. It no longer belonged to Elise. It belonged to all three of them. Every chipped ivory key carried a memory they never lived, but somehow deeply felt. The music wasn't just played anymore. It was prayer. One summer evening, while the golden light slanted through the kitchen window, Mason sat alone at the piano, eyes closed, fingers resting on the keys. Miles had just come back from the library with a worn book about songwriting. "Let's write her a song," he said, laying it on the bench beside his brother. "Not just play what she loved. Let's write something she would have sung to us. If she could." Mason didn't answer, but his fingers began to move. And that night, under the soft hum of cicadas and the ticking of their father's old clock, the twins wrote their first song. They called it Her Sunday Smile. It was simple, a soft ballad in a minor, lyrics about a mother they never met, but imagined every day. The chorus repeated a line Elise once wrote in her old journal, which they found folded between yellowed pages. Even if I'm not there to hold you, I'll be the wind behind your courage. They recorded the song on an ancient camcorder their dad had stashed in the attic. Miles uploaded it to a public YouTube channel with no expectations, just a title, For the Mom We Never Met. They didn't tell anyone, not even their dad, but the internet noticed. By the next morning, the video had a few hundred views. By the next week, it had over 100,000. Comments poured in, not just from music lovers, but from other children who had lost parents, from mothers who cried for the loss these boys carried with such grace, from strangers who felt like family after hearing their harmony. One woman from Maine wrote, "I lost my daughter during childbirth. I've hated the world ever since, but your song gave me peace I never thought I'd feel again." Another message read, "Your mother lives in every word. I hope you know that. Ipurni." Michael sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, staring at the screen in disbelief. He didn't say much, but when he turned to them, his eyes were glassy. She would have been proud, so proud. It was the first time he'd said her name in almost 5 years. And in that moment, in the soft flicker of a laptop glow, something happened, not just in their family, but in the world. These two boys, born from tragedy, had struck a note that reverberated across hearts, and it would not stop there. They didn't know it yet, but Her Sunday Smile was just the beginning. After the song went viral, life didn't suddenly become perfect. There was no flood of record deals, no overnight fame that made them rich, but something far more important happened. The silence that had wrapped itself around their home for so many years began to unravel. People started writing letters, dozens at first, then hundreds. Some were from music teachers asking to perform the song at school concerts. Others were from parents who played it at bedtime for their children, whispering, "This is what love sounds like." The ones that hit hardest were from kids, orphans, foster children, young hearts who carried an invisible ache. One letter, scribbled in crayon, simply said, "I don't have a mommy either, but your song made me feel like I do." That's when Mason turned to Miles one morning at breakfast, holding a handful of envelopes, and said, "We have to answer them." Miles frowned. "All of them?" Mason nodded. "Every single one." And so they did. They bought boxes of blank postcards and spent every evening after school replying by hand. Sometimes it was just a single line, "You're not alone." Other times it was a drawing of their piano, or lyrics rewritten with the kid's name slipped in. Michael helped too, quietly, mostly by driving them to the post office and reading the heavier letters when the boys were too overwhelmed to speak. It was the first time the Turners truly became a team. A few months later, they were invited to perform Her Sunday Smile live at a small grief support fundraiser in Chicago. It wasn't a big stage, just a fold-out piano in a church gym with foldable chairs and a crowd of maybe 60 people. But when the first notes rang out, something sacred swept the room. Even the air seemed to pause. A woman in the front row, who had buried her child 3 years earlier, pressed her hand to her chest and wept quietly. Next to her, a teenage boy with headphones dangling from his neck looked up, eyes locked on the twins, as if seeing himself for the first time in someone else's story. After they finished, there was no applause, just silence, deep, holy silence. And then, from the back of the room, someone stood. It was an elderly man, tall, weathered. His voice cracked as he said, "She gave her life for yours, and you've given that life to the rest of us. That's what legacy means." That night, they didn't sleep. They sat cross-legged on their hotel bed, hearts full, talking not about music, but about what came next. "We're not just making songs," Miles whispered. We're building her voice. And Mason, eyes soft, added, we're building her life. It was the first time they said it out loud, what they both knew deep down. They weren't trying to become famous. They were trying to become what she would have been. The moment they returned home from Chicago, something inside their father shifted. He walked into the living room, stared at the piano, and whispered, "It's time." The twins followed him, unsure what he meant, until he opened the door to the attic. They had only been there once, years ago, when they were too young to understand the gravity of old cardboard boxes and the dust that clung to forgotten photographs. But now, Michael moved with purpose, hands shaking only slightly as he pulled down a stack labeled Elise. Personal. Inside were journals, lesson plans, cassette tapes, birthday cards never sent, and one small notebook with the words "Someday Songs" etched in pencil on the cover. The boys froze. Inside the notebook were half-written lyrics, unfinished lullabies, musical notations scribbled between grocery lists. It was like finding pieces of her voice, scattered, but intact. She was going to start a children's music program, Michael explained, brushing a thumb over the page. For kids who couldn't afford lessons, she wanted to give them music, no matter what. Miles looked up, eyes wide. "Then let's do it." Michael blinked. "Do what?" "Let's build it. The program. A real one. In her name." They didn't have money, they didn't have space, but they had a purpose, and that was enough to begin. They called it the Memory House, a community center that would one day offer free music lessons, grief support through songwriting, and a stage for kids who felt like they didn't belong anywhere else. At first, it was just an idea, a dream scrawled on the back of school notebooks and whispered over late-night cocoa. But then, something strange happened. People offered help. A retired carpenter from their neighborhood showed up with lumber and said, "I knew Elise. She helped my daughter believe in herself. Let me build your benches." A local music store donated used instruments. An anonymous donor, moved by the twins' son, wired $20,000 with the note, "Build her voice. The world needs it." By the time they turned 16, Memory House was real, a cozy, converted bungalow near the edge of town, painted soft yellow with sky blue shutters and wind chimes that played her favorite chord, C major 7. The opening night was small, no red carpets, just folding chairs and hand-drawn posters, but it was magical. Mason sat on the porch with a shy 8-year-old girl, showing her how to hold a ukulele. Miles stood by the window, watching a group of kids laugh around a beat-up drum set that sounded like heaven. And in the corner of the music room, beneath a framed photo of Elise holding her baby bump, Michael played the first song he'd written in decades. It didn't matter that it was out of tune. The melody filled the house like sunlight. That night, as the last guest left, and the wind picked up the wind chimes, Mason whispered, "She would have loved this place." And Miles replied, "She already does." What began as a tribute became a movement. Word of the Memory House traveled faster than the twins expected. A local news station covered their story one rainy afternoon, the segment airing just before the evening weather forecast. The headline was simple: "Teen brothers build a music home for kids in memory of their mom." It could have ended there, but it didn't. By sunrise the next morning, their inbox had exploded. Teachers from across the country were asking for guidance to start similar programs. Grieving parents sent photos of their children holding ukuleles, violins, tambourines. Most of them donated, smiling for the first time in months. Journalists wanted interviews. A national TV producer left a voicemail that began with, "I cried. That never happens." And then came the invitation. It was from the Kennedy Center, Washington, D.C. They wanted the twins to perform at an event honoring young visionaries who had used art to heal communities. Miles dropped the letter when he read it. Mason just stared, stunned. Their father laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years. "Looks like your mom's getting her national debut." he said softly. The night of the event arrived like a dream. They wore matching charcoal suits, borrowed from neighbors, polished their scuffed shoes, and tucked a tiny photo of Elise into Mason's breast pocket. As they stood backstage under the weight of lights and anticipation, Miles whispered, "I'm nervous." Mason smiled. "Then let's make her proud." Childbirth. When they stepped into the spotlight, the theater fell silent. They didn't speak, didn't introduce themselves, just played, her Sunday smile, the same melody, the same chorus. But something had changed. Now, they weren't just singing for Elise. They were singing for every mother who left too soon, every child who waited for someone to come back. Every silence waits to be turned into song. And when the last note faded, there was no polite applause, only a standing ovation that rose like a wave. Uncontainable, backstage, an elderly woman approached them with trembling hands. "You brought my daughter back to me, just for a few minutes. Thank you." And in that moment, they understood something no award, no article, no camera could teach. Grief, when transformed by love, becomes medicine, not just for you, but for the world. Years passed, but the piano never stopped playing. By 23, the twins had turned the memory house into a foundation with branches in 5 states. Each location offered music therapy, free lessons, grief circles, and most importantly, hope. They didn't chase fame, but it found them anyway. Not the celebrity kind, but the kind that etched names into hearts. They received letters from places they had never been, villages in South Africa, shelters in Romania, children's hospitals in Brazil, all from people who had heard the song, or read the story, or simply passed through one of their yellow houses with blue shutters and wind chimes that played in Elise's key, but they never let it change them. They still returned home every Sunday, to the original house, to the piano, to the room where it all began. One afternoon, Mason was playing softly while Miles stared out the window at the tree their mother had planted before they were born. It had grown tall now, branches twisting like arms reaching toward the sky. Birds nested there. Children from the neighborhood sometimes tied paper wishes to its branches. "I've been thinking," Miles said suddenly, "what if we wrote a book?" Mason paused. "A book?" "Yeah, about her, about us, about how you don't have to be whole to build something beautiful." Mason smiled. "Then let's call it that." "Call it what?" "Something beautiful." They never wrote it for sales. They wrote it for every child who thought their beginning defined their ending, for every father too lost to speak, for every silence still waiting to be healed. When it was released, a first-grade teacher in Kansas read it to her class. A widowed father in Oregon kept it by his bedside. A 12-year-old boy in India translated it into Hindi for his younger sister, who couldn't read English. And on the book's final page, under the dedication, were 5 words: "For the woman we never met." On the 20th anniversary of their mother's passing, the twins held a concert in the backyard of their childhood home. No stage, just the piano under the tree. Dozens came, then hundreds. Families sat on blankets. Children danced barefoot. A screen behind the piano displayed home footage of Elise, laughing, singing, glowing. As twilight set in, Miles stood and faced the crowd. "My brother and I never knew our mother," he said, "but we've spent every day trying to become the kind of sons she would have been proud of. If you have ever lost someone, and you wondered if they still matter, look around. They do. You do." Mason joined him, hands in his pockets, voice steady. "She gave us life, but it was up to us to give that life meaning. We just chose to do it through song." Then they played, not for applause, not for recognition, but because that's what love does. It keeps singing, even when the voice is gone. Even when the world forgets, the song remembers. Some stories are written with ink. Theirs was written in song, in silence. And in the spaces where grief meets grace, Miles and Mason Turner were never handed a perfect beginning. They were born into loss, but through music, Through memory and a mother's quiet legacy, they built something the world could not ignore. They reminded us all that even if someone is gone, their love doesn't have to be, it can live in what we create, in what we share, in what we choose to honor. Because sometimes the loudest legacy begins with a whisper.